Christian church, and we went all the way to the Reformation. Today, we're going from the Reformation to the present day, and while that's not such a huge length of time, there's a lot that's going to be happening. So remember that the Reformation is a time of massive upheaval that isn't just questioning the church, it's questioning everything. People are reading the Bible for the first time for themselves and interpreting it how they will. The states meaning governments are being separated from the church. You get the French Revolution, you get Henry VIII, all of these things. So we had Unitarianism in Poland, which was eventually annihilated, and in Transylvania, which we talked about last week. So the other place that Unitarianism emerges is in England. And in England, let's see here, not that one. In England, there is, if I get the right page, there are people who start coming in, who start questioning the traditional Trinitarian theology. Universalism has pretty much disappeared for a while and is now starting to make its way back up. So we're going to kind of be going back and forth between Unitarian and Universalist history because they are so interwoven at this point, okay? Yeah? In England, it was right around the same time as the Cromwells came into history, so right around the English Revolution, yeah. So Samuel Gordon is not considered an official, Universalist theologian. He was a Puritan who settled in Massachusetts who came upon the realization of universalism after reading his Bible. And of course, at that time, remember that Massachusetts was a theocracy, so he got kicked out. A lot of the reason that he came to this understanding was his work with the indigenous peoples in the United States, and realizing that a loving God would not damn a whole bunch of people to hell just because they had never heard of God. You also get, as Kelly mentioned during the service, George de Benneville. George de Benneville, he was born in France and England. His lineage is kind of combined. And he came to the United States, and he really was the one that started things moving with universalism. He believed that God was absolute love. That was his piece. And then, of course, you get John Murray. So Kelly briefly talked about John Murray in the service. If you didn't go to this, you'll go to the second service and you'll hear about him again. There is a myth around John Murray, and I'm going to briefly tell you this story. So John Murray was originally a Methodist. He has a really terrible, horrible background. I mean, he was married, he had children, he became an evangelist. He tried to evangelize a woman in England who was a Universalist, and he said, I'm going to convince this woman that she is wrong. And then they sat down and argued, and he couldn't convince her that she was wrong, and rather came away frustrated and said, I throw my hands up. She's damned, but I can't tell her why. In the meantime, his wife and his children die. He becomes destitute. He gets on a ship to come to America, and he gets hung up on a shoal in South Jersey and finds a lovely farmer who will take him in until they can move up the coast to the tide comes in and the wind goes the right way so he can go to New York. He sits in this farmer's house until that tide turns. The farmer's name is Thomas Potter, and Thomas Potter says, if the tide goes, I wish you well. If it does not, you are going to stay with us and preach at our church on Sunday. Thomas Potter was a Universalist. I think he was kind of destined for Universalism. And John Murray, of course, did not make his ship. It did not go where it needed to go. He preached, and he was also converted to Universalism. And then he became probably the biggest evangelist of Universalism here in the United States. And if you go visit New Jersey, you can go to Murray Grove, which is one of the Unitarian Universalist camps there. camp and retreat center there. So let's do a brief timeline. The first general society, which is the gathering of Universalist churches, happens in 1778. So there are Universalist churches just kind of popping up all over the place in this early time period. Eventually, just a few years later in 1785, the annual conventions happen. At the first general society, however, let's go back to the first one, is when they actually make a determination on how they're going to ordain their ministers. I name this because the Universalists were big into polity and how they were going to organize themselves. We lost that when we became Unitarian Universalists. So just, I feel like it's really important to name when we have a failing. This was one of our failings. So in 1793, then, the Universalist Church in America was formed, the UCA. And 1805 is when we get Hosea Ballou, and he is the first real written theologian of Universalism. He is the first person who systematically wrote the theology of Universalism down on paper. I have a whole bunch of his books in my office if you'd ever like to read any of them. We probably have some in our libraries as well. And then in 1819, the first Universalist magazine was printed. And I'm sure if any of you have read any history of the 1800s, there were magazines and tracts and newsletters because it was the only way you communicated with people, right? You'd get mailings of things. And so this was huge that we had our first magazine. There were points throughout the 18th or the 19th century in which Universalism was considered the 9th and the 6th largest denomination. It was huge, and over time it slowly shrunk more and more. All right?
Why did it shrink?
That's a really good question. Elias, do you know? No, I don't have that answer either. Joe?
How does it get to be 6th and 9th?
At different periods. So I think it was in the 1830s, it was the 9th, and the 1870s, it was the 6th, so at different periods of time. I don't know why it shrunk. Yeah, they were much more evangelical. And so that didn't appeal to everyone. And also, think about it, they're countering the large mainstream heaven and hell theology. That's a really hard conversation to have, an argument that's really, really difficult to win, right? I know I said this in my sermon, how I believe that heaven and hell are actually part of a control and power piece. And part of that, I believe, is not only does that hold that fear and that tension in so you can control people, but it also allows you the opportunity to really, who doesn't like to be the chosen ones, right? If you believe that you're going to heaven, aren't you special in some way, right? So not only is it about power, but it's also about feeling special, right? Yes, one of the cool kids, yes. All right, so now let's talk about Unitarianism. So 1615 to 1662, John Biddle lived, and he was the first Unitarian officially ordained minister he was a minister in a different tradition who became Unitarian, but he was the first official Unitarian minister in England. And he founded the Essex Chapel in London in he didn't, obviously, he would have been dead. He articulated it first, and then it created a following, and Essex Chapel was founded in London several years after his death, where Joseph Priestley lived and worked for a time. And if any of you go back in Unitarian Universalist history, Joseph Priestley is a huge figure in American Unitarianism because after he was part of this church in England, he came here to the United States. Sorry, just trying to read all of my notes. So Joseph Priestley was a scientist. He actually invented carbonated water. He also found the oxygen molecule. Like, you know, most of the educated at this particular time in history weren't just one thing. They were a whole bunch of things. So he was a scientist. He believed in the Enlightenment and rationalism, but he had a very Christian theist perspective to it. He also was a huge proponent for religious tolerance and equal rights, and he helped found Unitarianism in the UK as a larger denomination. He supported the American Revolution, which when you're in England and you're supporting the American Revolution doesn't make you a very well-loved person. And so he was forced to flee several times from his home in England and then eventually came here to Pennsylvania. And he founded the first Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. And for a time, back in the day, when we were districts rather than regions, so you have all of the churches in the various different states, and they all build up to, at that time, districts. Now we only build up to regions. There was a Joseph Priestley district. So you may have heard his name and not realized who or what he was. All right. I believe so. Yeah, he had to, like, it was bad. He was not well liked towards the end there, yes. So, we're going to take a quick time out, but I don't remember why I put the time out, so give me a second. Okay. So, yes, woohoo! Okay, so you have the founding of the first Unitarian Church in Philadelphia, but you don't have pretty much any other churches founded at that time. How did we become so large of a denomination, the Unitarians, and specifically in New England? So, remember, at this time, the Puritans are settling into New England. Now, if you're a Puritan, here's that Calvinist in you, or in me, there is stipulations for when you will become a member in a Puritan church. To become a member in a Puritan church, you have to have some sort of supernatural conversion experience. Apparently, a lot of people had supernatural conversion experiences, but you also have to go before your congregation and you have to confess all of your sins. Not enough time. There you go. So you can imagine how easily they won converts. And in fact, what became the problem was their churches started dropping in attendance and in membership because even children of Puritans couldn't be guaranteed this supernatural conversion experience, and most of them did not want to participate in the confession of their sins in front of a whole bunch of people. There is a lovely podcast called Grim and Mild, and the first season is like 15 episodes of the Salem witch trial, and they actually talk about these dynamics and how they played into the Salem witch trial. It is fascinating, and I totally recommend it. You learn a lot more about Puritan New England and all of the things, and understand the Puritan church. So what happens is they start being more lenient about who can become members in the Puritan churches, because otherwise they're going to lose all of their members. And remember, at this time, it's a theocracy. So the churches are paying taxes to the governments, right? So they can't lose membership, because if they lose membership, then they can't pay their taxes, right? So this is where the Puritan churches become congregational. And I'm sure you've heard of congregational churches. We have some here. It is a denomination. It is a denomination somewhat like ours in that it's a congregational polity. Each church chooses how it itself runs itself and governs. And then what happens is that Unitarian theologians and ministers start happening. And a lot of those Congregationalist churches hire Unitarian ministers who then convert their congregation to Unitarian Universalism. So when I say that our ancestors are Puritans, I mean our ancestors are Puritans just in this very, very weird, bizarre, roundabout way. All right? So this is the timeout.
How did you become a Unitarian minister when there wasn't a denomination?
How did you become a Unitarian minister when there wasn't a denomination? Most of these intellectual ideas were happening in both theological schools, but also just through correspondence and magazines and newspapers and all of those pieces. And so ministers who might be ordained in a different denomination but converted to this particular understanding of the world and then would bring that out into the world. So you wouldn't have been ordained as a Unitarian at this moment. You might have been ordained as a congregational minister who then became a Unitarian. And I should also add that this is one of the legacies that we still hold today, actually, in that ministers are ordained by our congregations and not by our denominational body. And this is a holdover from the Puritans and the Congregationalists as well, because they have that same practice. So I cannot have my ordination revoked except by a congregation, and that's never happened in Unitarian Universalism from what I know of. What I can have revoked is my fellowship, which is what is granted by the Unitarian Universalist Association. I know, it's a weird system, but that's the way it works in ours. So, all of those Puritan churches are becoming Congregationalists, are becoming Unitarians, and in 1787, King's Chapel in Boston becomes a Unitarian congregation with the ordination of James Friedman, who becomes their minister. So he was a Unitarian, not ordained as Unitarian, but ordained in this church. He was a Unitarian. He converted King's Chapel from a Puritan church and became a Unitarian church. And you can go visit King's Chapel. It's actually a really cool church in Boston. How many of you have been there? Cool. It's really cool. They still have the little box seats, and they use a Book of Common Prayer. It's different. I mentioned already that the first Unitarian church in Philadelphia was founded by Joseph Priestley. Obviously, this was after. This timeline goes back and forth because this is all bizarre. There's just so much going on at the same time. In 1802, the oldest church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, splits over the ministers' liberalism and becomes Unitarian. So you can see that the Puritan congregational Unitarian movement begins to happen, and it is causing some kerfluffle because people are angry about the old ways versus the new ways. Things don't change very much, do they? Henry Ware Sr. becomes the first professor of divinity. So at Harvard. There's no Harvard Divinity School yet. He becomes the first professor of divinity at Harvard. He is a Unitarian. And in 1811, Harvard Divinity School is established, and Harvard was established as a Unitarian divinity school. It is no longer. Chris?
So all these ministers were Unitarians. Do they still consider themselves Christian, or is that?
Yes. At this point, all of these Unitarian ministers are considering themselves Christian. Yeah. Same with the Universalists. And then we get to 1819, and we get Channing. So William Ellery Channing, that's a mouthful. He was a Unitarian minister, and he became the first person in a sermon to articulate a Unitarian Christianity in which he stripped Jesus of his divine powers and said Jesus is human first. Now, that sounds great in a lot of ways, and it was. I mean, it's a huge transition from the Trinity, from all of those pieces. And what he did in this also was he created, and if you go back 2 sermons ago, I mentioned this. this concept that Channing does in this sermon that he gives is part of our sources to this day. The inherent worth and dignity of every person came out of both traditions, and Channing's articulation of Jesus as fully human and not divine was part of that, but it also created a sense of godlikeness that any human could then become. And while that's somewhat problematic, because then you don't have some humility that we all need when we make mistakes. So this was a huge thing theologically, which was wonderful, and today that legacy has some problems. He was a cool dude, though. You can check out some of his sermons on the UUA's website. Yeah.
Isn't part and parcel of saying that you're a Unitarian, saying that there isn't godliness in the Holy Spirit and Jesus, that it's God?
That it's just God, yes.
So you're saying he's the first one to express that Jesus is human, but then what were Unitarians saying before this, that Jesus was a portion of God, but isn't that Trinitarian?
No. Jesus was part of God, but God was the emphasis. This was the first time that was actually articulated, that Jesus was taken out of the Trinity. They still had this sense of, how would you articulate it?
There are different ways that it was done, but it's considered parasitic representation, right? So you can become an Arian, right? Which is kind of Jesus is kind of a reflection of God somehow, but not really God. Or you have
Right.
adoptionism, right?
Right.
Jesus is brought into the God cell,
Right.
right? So it's still just one, right? But not
Right. 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 So if we go back to what we talked about in the last session, this is going back to some of those, I'm not even going to remember their names at this point, but there were some of those theologians who understood Jesus, the idea of the Trinity in a way that was not three separate persons, but yet they were all one. And so that's, Jesus as God is part of God and not separate from God. That is the kind of Unitarian we're talking about here. Yeah.
I think the incarnation is the element that
Yeah.
separates it. We don't talk about Jesus. Trinitarians don't think Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. They think that the second person of the Trinity is incarnated into the person, Jesus. And so conflating that confuses the issue. They don't, so
Yes.
making Jesus the part of the Trinity isn't exactly what Trinitarian theologians did.
Yeah. Depending on the version, yes. So it wasn't until Channing actually articulated that Jesus was just human and not divine that we lost any sense of divinity there. And so there really is this articulation of it's only God. You lose the Holy Spirit and Jesus becomes human. It's a whole different piece. Yeah.
So did the Unitarians not believe in salvation, redemption, having to make it?
No, they did. They just did it through God, not through Jesus. They skipped Jesus. Yes. Yes. Though that would become less and less over time. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Seems to me that Jesus, I've never been Christian, but it seems to me that Jesus is pretty much teaching the same virtues as all the other prophets. Isaiah, Moses, Muhammad,
Right.
pick one, they're all teaching the same thing.
They are very all similar. Yes. Yes. And you can actually find some biblical scholars that talk about the potential influence of Eastern traditions, because remember, Hinduism is much far older than Christianity, onto Jesus, actually. So no one actually knows, because we don't actually know who Jesus was, but there are those, they are out there. 1820, the Berry Street essay happens. It happens at Harvard for the first time. It is a lecture that is given by a minister. And you all saw part of the Berry Street essay from this year when in August we did the video during adult learning by Reverend Cecilia Kingman on fascism. The Berry Street essay has continued every single year since then. And you can go look online and look up all of them. There's some really, really good ones. The American Unitarian Association is actually officially founded in 1825, and it just so happens that that's the same year that the British and the Foreign Unitarian Association was also founded, but that was not intentional. It just so happened to have fallen that way. And because we need to talk a little bit about transcendentalism, we're going to do the first little piece here. In 1838, Ralph Waldo Emerson gave the Divinity School address. So you have Harvard Divinity School that's now in essence, in around almost 20 years, educating Unitarians into ministry. And Ralph Waldo Emerson is invited to do the Divinity School address for the graduating students. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson kind of turned everything upside down in his, I'm trying to find my notes again, in his piece here that he did at the address. So he basically said that there was no point in having any sort of minister ever, that they were all wasting their time, and that we should all just go out into nature and find God. You can imagine how well that went over. This was his transcendentalism, and transcendentalism was picked up by many Unitarian ministers, rightfully so, because it had a religious naturalism to it that is very appealing to a very intellectual science, beginning to marry the science and religious piece together. That is a legacy that Unitarianism can hold. So it makes sense that transcendentalism emerged. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian minister until he gave this Divinity School address. And then, he proclaimed that transcendentalism was more important than Unitarianism. He believed that moral intuition was a better guide than religious doctrine. He totally discounted any belief of miracles of Jesus, even more so than just what Channing had done. He rejected a personal God, and he castigated ministers for suffocating the soul through lifeless preaching. You can imagine that went over really, 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 really well. So, you have a big upheaval in Unitarianism at this point. In 1844, the first Unitarian theological school is created. That is, because now what's happening at Harvard is that they have they're still Unitarian at this point, but it's slowly evolving to include education of other denominational ministers. And Unitarians found Meadville Theological School. And if you have questions about that history, we have a resident expert here who can help you with that. Yes, that was founded in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and then they moved to Lombard, Illinois. No? Which one did they go to next?
No, there was Lombard College.
Lombard College.
Universalist side, they merged in Hyde Park.
So it went from Meadville, Pennsylvania to Lombard College, which was Universalist, to then to Hyde Park, which was where they were until Lee Barker moved them to Michigan Avenue, and then you moved them to the Loop. Okay, so this is the Divinity School address. Or I talked about the Divinity School address. These are and this is really small, so I'm going to read it to you all. This is the principles of transcendentalism that is beginning to emerge at this time. It's the inherent goodness of people and nature. Society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual. People are at the best when they are truly self-reliant and independent. Divine experience is inherent in the everyday rather than believing in a distant heaven. Physical and spiritual phenomena as part of a dynamic process rather than as discrete entities. How many of you all are familiar with transcendentalism-ish? Yeah. So transcendentalism hasn't changed, and actually there are Unitarian Universalists who consider themselves transcendentalists to this day. And so this becomes a part, for some people more, some congregations more than others, it becomes a part of Unitarianism that is highly rational, much more attached to science. Now we're going to switch over to the Universalists. So we talked about Hosea Ballou, who was the first Universalist theologian who laid things out systemically. This is his son, Aidan Ballou. And the reason I remember Ballou is because of the Jungle Book, I just have to say. So Aidan Ballou believed in pacifism. He actually created a communal living situation in Hopedale. It was called the Hopedale Community. I believe it started in Massachusetts and then moved to upstate New York, or maybe vice versa, I can't remember. There was a whole bunch of these coming forth at this time, and not just in Universalism, but in other different denominations. Because remember, at this time, spiritualism is starting to become a movement, and Aidan Ballou actually has some ties to spiritualism. That same podcast I told you about the Salem witch trials, also the second season is about spiritualism, and it begins talking about Aidan Ballou's understanding. But Aidan Ballou is most well known for his nonviolence. That's not nonviolent communication, that's nonviolence, his pacifism. His writings actually made it to Tolstoy, who really loved his ideas and incorporated them in his own understanding, which eventually ended up making it to Gandhi. So his work is very, very important to the longer picture of what Universalism has brought to the world. You also have Olympia Brown. She was the first woman ordained in the Universalist tradition and the second woman ordained in any tradition in the United States. She was a suffragette and and she actually had a congregation named after her in Wisconsin. For those of you who weren't at this first service, there were a whole bunch of women ordained right after her. And because they couldn't find parishes in the East, whether that's New England or elsewhere, because heaven forbid you hire a woman minister, they were hired here in the Midwest, where people were slowly moving to the West. And we have a resident expert on this. If any of you know Cindy Tucker, she's a member here. She is a scholar of Unitarian and Universalist history, especially the women ministers who emerged in this time period. And I have one of her books, a signed copy, in my office. I think we have one in the library, and she's done presentations here. So we actually have a resident expert here. All right, so then we get to Theodore Parker. He's my favorite. So, Theodore Parker is an abolitionist. He has one of the most famous sermons out there named The Transient and the Permanent. His writing desk is actually in Elias Ortega's office, my partner's office. He used to write on it and keep his gun in the drawer underneath because he was such a strong abolitionist, he had received threats of violence against his personhood. So I'm going to read these two quotes, and let me know if you've heard these before, or pieces of this. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. Obviously, MLK was very taken with Theodore Parker. In fact, actually, there are some rumors that MLK would have been a Unitarian if it was not for his history. I think it's slightly more complicated than that, but it's fun to think about. The domestic function of the woman does not exhaust her powers. To make 1/2 of the human race consume its energies in the functions of housekeeper, wife, and mother is a monstrous waste of the most precious material God ever made. Yes! You see why he's my favorite? He was a man far ahead of his time, and actually pieces of his writing were picked up by Abraham Lincoln, who actually included elements of it in the Gettysburg Address. He was a transcendentalist. He was also a universalist. He was both. He was hugely impactful in the abolitionist movement, to the point that actually when he died in Italy, trying to get relief from his tuberculosis, Frederick Douglass actually visited his grave. The first thing he did, Frederick Douglass, when he got off in Italy, was to actually visit Parker's grave. I really, really love his work. And his congregation in New England included some very famous people. Louisa May Alcott, William Lloyd Garrison, Julia Ward Howe, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were all members at Theodore Parker's. So he's a really cool person. Now, at this time, what we're also getting, this is later 1800s, there is a lot of Unitarian and a lot of Universalist churches that are starting to emerge in New England, heading down to the mid-Atlantic states, moving into upstate New York and Pennsylvania, but the West is not happening at all. And so eventually people are realizing, oh, wait, we need to grow ourselves beyond just the confines of where we've always been. And we had some folks who did that. So all of those women ministers, they are starting to do that in the Midwest. Thomas Starr King goes all the way to California. He was a Unitarian minister who was also a Universalist. So he went around preaching and establishing churches in the California area, hoping to grow our faith. So we get to the in-between, because we're going to skip several years, not because it's not important, because it absolutely is, but because there's just so much here to cover, and we've got like 20 minutes. So there's a lot going on, and we can talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's uncle. I can never remember his name because I don't really like him. He actually was the founder of the World's Parliament of Religions, which was fabulous, but he also encouraged the Tulsa race riots. So no, his last name was Lloyd Wright too, but I can't remember his first name. There's a lot going on in this in-between time, including a lot of movement in justice movements. The suffrage movement, labor rights, class issues, education, abolitionists, all of this is happening at this time. And we, whether through our Unitarians or through our Universalists, are really getting our fingers into a whole bunch of different things. The best person to read, if you want a book on this, is Dan McCannon, who is a Unitarian Universalist scholar at Harvard. He has a book called The Prophethood of Believers? No, The Prophetic something. I have it in my office. John Lloyd Wright? No, that's not right. Jenkin Lloyd Jones, thank you. So you were right, Jones, thank you. There are also some things that are not going so well. So because we are not perfect, right, as a faith movement. And at this point in time, the Unitarians are starting, not all of them, a subset of Unitarians are starting to promote eugenics at this point. It was part of the mental health reform movement that was happening at that time. We're not perfect. So, Unitarian history continues. The Beacon Press is established in 1902. I'm sure you've heard of Beacon Press. That's still one of our 2 publishing houses that we have books published with. And then in 1904, Starr King School for the Ministry is established. Who's it founded, or it's not founded by, but his name is used, as the Thomas Starr King's name is used. And it is the second, so we have two now. Harvard is no longer, and Andover Newton is no longer in existence. We have only two Unitarian Universalist schools for ministry, Meadville and Starr King. Throughout all of this time, but especially in 1937, Unitarians and Universalists are considering merger. Both of the denominations have found at different various moments that they're either losing members or they're losing money and they want to consider a merger. Plus, it's more powerful when you have work that's happening together. And so they're both doing justice work, they're both doing a lot of movement work, and so they considered merger several different times. In 1939, the Unitarian Service Committee is established. In 1940, the Universalist Service Committee is established. And you know that they both came together at some point and became the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee when the denominations formed. And you notice that they're forming right at World War II, right? I believe in December, I could be getting the date wrong, but I believe in December, Steve Cooper is going to show the documentary by Ken Burns about Wait Still and Martha Sharp, who were the two folks from the Unitarian Service Committee who went to Europe to help get people back to the United States. All sorts of people, not just Jews. It was Jews and queer folk and the disabled, because the Nazis were targeting everyone. In 1944, the Church of the Larger Fellowship is established. How many of you have heard of the Church of the Larger Fellowship? All right. So the Church of the Larger Fellowship still exists. It is right now the largest church we have. It has no building. It is all online. Its biggest ministry is the prison ministry. And anyone can join and become a member. Lots of ministers are members there because then they don't have to be part of a church, like a brick and mortar church building. But it's actually founded in 1944, and it's done all the way through correspondence. So you would get in the mail things for religious education or for your sermon. And it's still in existence today, which is kind of exciting. In 1949, the Unitarian Fellowship Movement is founded. Now, I want to talk about this because you all have said, well, in your reports, like your congregational record, that you all were considered part of the fellowship movement at your founding. That's not entirely true. So the fellowship movement was a time when the Unitarians were trying to evangelize and spread the word, but they didn't have enough ministers. So in order to do that, they were creating lay-led congregations around the world. Many more of them are on the East Coast, but there are some here. Appleton, that big congregation in Wisconsin, was founded as a fellowship and still has that as their name. The fellowship movement was somewhat successful at the time, but many of those congregations have lost themselves, or they're just so tiny, because the lay-led leadership piece is complex when they finally decide they want to call a minister. The reason you all do not technically fall into this category is not because you weren't founded at the right time, because you were founded in the 1950s when the fellowship movement was at its largest, but because you were founded by a minister. It might not have been a Unitarian minister at the time. He was a congregational minister who became Unitarian, but you were founded by a minister, which means you're not technically a fellowship. Make sense? We can talk about fellowships if you want. My first congregation where I worked with was a fellowship, and they have a very, very interesting cultural dynamic. All right. And then in 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists finally joined together. So let's just hit some brief highlights. Both decide to lose their doctrines, Unitarian and Universalism, and instead they come together and create the 7 principles. Now, what happens here is that we become more pluralistic meaning we have many different belief systems, because many people can believe in our 7 principles, but not everybody is going to believe in universalism or Unitarianism, right? So this is a huge shift for us. And actually, the biggest influx of folks that we get are actually Jews after World War II, because they can no longer, many of them feel like they can no longer be part of Judaism, and so they want something that works for a better world, but they don't want to necessarily believe all of the things that they have always believed. But that just expanded, and so the congregation we were part of in New Jersey had 30% of the members were Jewish, right? That's a huge number, right? But if you go to the West Coast, you might find congregations that are much more heavily Buddhist because of the influence on the West Coast with Buddhism, right? So this is what's happened with the Unitarian Universalist Association. The other piece that gets complex here is that our congregational polity, which is how we run our churches and then have a larger denomination as a framework, pieces of it were adopted from Unitarians and pieces of it were adopted from Universalists, and it created just this amalgam that is still, there's still some questions, even, 60 years later? I can't even do math these days. So we've got some questions here around, say, who's in charge, right? We don't have a bishop that's appointing ministers. Congregations ordain ministers. You see the complexities here. So if you're looking for more information on this, Conrad Wright wrote a book called Congregational Polity. And if you're a geek like me, it's fascinating. You can find it online, actually. You don't even, you can find the full text online on the UUA's website because it's out of print and ministers have to read it. And he does a great job of explaining what the processes were for how ministers were ordained and how lay leaders played a role in that, and then the weird amalgamation that happened when they merged and all of the problems that have since arisen. Yeah, lots of problems. I think that might be my last slide. Yeah. All right. So, in the meantime, I want to briefly share 2 things. One is there are a lot of other things that are happening during this whole period. And one of the biggest pieces that I did not cover but is really, really important is the issue of race in Unitarian Universalism. Because we haven't done very, very well with race in Unitarian Universalism. I highly recommend Mark Morrison Reed's books on this. He was a former professor at Meadville Lombard, and he has some fabulous books that talk about how the early seminaries would ordain specifically black men to the ministry, and then they could never find congregations who were willing to lead them. It was a problem. There were also some of the schools that the Universalist Service Committee established to help educate young black students. The way they treated some of their black women specifically, but some of the black men leaders that they had, there's a lot of controversy and problems there. We've had a very difficult time with racism in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. But what happened after 1961, when we merged, is we became really invested in the civil rights movement. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were congregations who fired their ministers for going to the South, and there were congregations that said, if you don't go to the South, we will fire you. So you have all of these different things happening at the same time. But we did show up, and we showed up very much en masse. You all have heard the story, or if not, I can give you the story of Reverend James Reeb, who with his Orloff Miller and Clark Olson were attacked by some white supremacists shortly before the Selma March. We were involved, and what happened was we actually became the most diverse denomination in the United States after that. And then the black empowerment controversy happened. Bill Sinkford, former UUA president, calls it the white empowerment controversy, which might be a better named a phrase for the situation. But I would highly recommend The Wilderness Journey. It's a YouTube video that it talks about our history with this. And then it didn't just end. We lost a huge segment of our Black siblings and cousins in the denomination. And we have some that have stuck with us, which is fabulous, even though we've gotten it wrong. And we were called out on it in the 90s, we were called out on it in the 2000s, and we've been called out on it in 2017, which resulted in the Commission on Institutional Changes report, which you can also read online, or ask one of the commissioners. My partner, Elias Ortega, was also one of the commissioners on that report. We have struggled with racism in our denomination. That's not blatant, like we don't like you because you're Black. It is, we have to really work on our microaggressions and our assumptions around racism in the larger denomination and in some of our congregations as well. So Mark Morrison Reed's book, lots of denominational resources on this, and the documentary is what I would highly recommend. And just a fun little ending before we take some questions. I'm just going to list off a few really fun names of some famous Unitarian or Universalists. Louisa May Alcott, Susan B. Anthony, Sarah Josephine Baker, Henry Berg, who was the founder of the ASPCA, Ray Bradbury, Sophia Lyon Fahs, Frances Harper, Julia Ward Howe, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mary White Ovington, who was the founder of the NAACP, William Howard Taft, P.T. Barnum, Bela Bartok, Clara Barton, Whitney Young, Dorothea Dix, Margaret Fuller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, Herman Melville, Beatrix Potter, Sylvia Plath, Kurt Vonnegut, and William Carlos Williams. You can go up online and look some more. Pete Seeger is another one. We've got a whole bunch of folks to our names. Christopher Reeve. All right, that was a lot in 45 minutes. Questions, thoughts?
Would you mind putting together all the resources you mentioned during this talk and sharing it in the newsletter or something like that?
I can absolutely put together all of the resources. You're gonna have to wait until I get back from vacation. The question was, can I put together the resources? And I will do that. Yeah.
Can we get your PowerPoint emailed to us?
I can also do the PowerPoint. Sure. I'm gonna write myself a note though.
The Wilderness Journey was the name
Of the documentary, The Wilderness Journey is the documentary that's on YouTube.
How about recording this and putting it up on our page, website, YouTube collection of services? Because this is informative for people who are browsing for finding a church home.
Joe asks if we can put this up on YouTube. It's already there. It's happening right now, thanks to Justin. It's on our YouTube channel, as is the previous one as well. Yeah. Yes?
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more? I thought you said that the Universalists were somewhat highly rational, but they also had the moral intuition. I mean, it seems the moral intuition and the rational somewhat are...
Right. So the rational comes from the Unitarians' merger with, specifically with science, whereas the moral intuition, that's the transcendentalism.
But you're saying that in humanism has a high degree of moral intuition in it?
Transcendentalism.
I know, but I thought you... Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about humanism to some extent. Or I thought you said that...
Human, you're right. Humanism doesn't come into play really until the turn between the 19th and 20th century. I mean, it happens somewhat before that, but it's really like with the Humanist Manifesto is where it's really starting to get bigger. And we did have some ministers who latched onto it very early. But what I was talking about there is transcendentalism versus Unitarianism.
Are you aware of any connection to the historical Jesus movement, like the I think Thomas Boyd
So the question was if I'm aware of anything around the Reclaiming Jesus movement. I do not know, but I bet you do. Voluntold.
I think the only thing I can say that there's been some connection with some ministers and a few UU scholars, but not as kind of leading voices, but some connection.
Thanks. All right. Thought? Questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One more name for we Illinoisans, who was a Unitarian Universalist, Adlai Stevenson, former governor of Illinois, and he was a member of the Bloomington UU Church. And if you go down there, last time I was there, there's a picture of he had his memorial service there, and in the front row, I think he died during LGBTJ's administration, and so. Johnson is there, and a whole, bunch of other U.S. governmental dignitaries at the Bloomington Church for Adlai Stevenson's memorial service.
That's cool. Do you want me to move that around? That would be great, Kat. Thank you.
This question is really not about the history of the church, but it's more about the future. You talked about the problems with racism and so on, and it seems like all congregations and all, not even just our church, but all denominations seem to be losing members. Do you know of plans that UU and the new president have to reach out to minorities, but also to all people to, try to build back numbers and even grow?
Right. So, as you can imagine, the idea of evangelism, because that's really what you're talking about, has never been a real big thing in Unitarian Universalism, because we're trying to convert you, right? It's a little different for us, right? We're not actually trying to convert you. We're just trying to show you there's love in the world, right? I don't know Sophia's platform on this particular topic. I would say that this is a really complex, multifaceted issue, right? But if we're going to really do this really well, we actually need to look to our children and youth and young adults. I think that that's really where we need to, and not only ours here, which we don't always put enough time and energy into, but out in the world. I would love to see us do some campus ministry, for instance. And that's not to say that I'm ignoring the bigger picture, like the older folks, because that's not what I'm doing. But if we're going to talk about long-term sustainability, we got to talk about future generations, right? That's just what we have to do. So that's on my radar. I bet you Sophia has some thoughts on this. In fact, I know she has some thoughts on this. I just don't know what they are. She still has her website up. You could probably go take a look and see what she says. Yeah.
Before the separation of, before the Unitarianism and Universalism merged, what was the differences in their beliefs?
Basically the theology, the all will be saved, and then the one God piece. Because some Universalists were still Trinitarians, right? They hadn't, and some were together, right? Some, like Thomas Starr King was a Unitarian who also believed in Universalism, right? But it was basically the main theological roots. Yeah. I think we can probably do one more.
Let me share a personal anecdote regarding the previous question about the numbers of Unitarians. Back in the early days of my joining the movement, I became active in district affairs, and I wrote a small piece for a newsletter and made reference to millions of Unitarians. and that was before I ever knew that at that time, the number of population of Unitarians was around 125,000.
Yeah. We're a little bit larger than that now.
So in my... Right. I caught a lot of flack for my expansive interpretation
yeah.
of our membership.
Right. And we do have partners around the world, right? So there's a huge Unitarian population in the Philippines. There's one in the Khasi Hills of India, a lot still in Hungary, Transylvania, etc., and in the UK. Most of those are Christian, though. They didn't lose their Christianity in this, so. And I'll be meeting a whole bunch of, well, Elias will be meeting a whole bunch of them this week when we're in Prague, so. All right, any other questions, thoughts? All right, thank you all for coming. Yeah.